How beautiful that you would have had the great forethought to have us celebrate this Mass for Jesus Christ, the High Priest, as you who pray for our priests and who see that as part of your calling, reflect on your calling and also on the calling of our brother priests. Certainly, as we listen to the gospel today, we recognize the great sacrifice that Jesus offered as he offers his body and blood. It was a sacrifice that was offered not just on Calvary Hill, or not just once, but a sacrifice that would be offered for us throughout all of history. Jesus, as part of his Father's plan, understood that it would be important that there would be those who would be able to offer that same sacrifice, that same gift, who would be able to feed his people with the Lord's very body and blood, who would heed what the Lord says, "Do this in remembrance of me." Every time that we gather for the Eucharist, we do what we do in remembrance of Christ. And it's through the actions of the priest that we're able to continue that great gift of the Eucharist that Jesus offered to us that first Holy Thursday in that upper room. It's so important that we always see that connection between the Eucharist and priesthood. And so we really celebrate both of those sacraments each time that we gather for the Mass of the Lord's Supper on Holy Thursday. It's important, I think, that we consider the context of what takes place there as well. We have a fuller opportunity to do that in the Holy Thursday liturgy, where there's also the washing of the feet, where we come to recognize that Jesus, the one who gives us his body and blood, is the one who came to serve rather than to be served. The one who humbles himself to wash even the feet of his students, of those apostles. There's that connection between the gift that he gives us of the Eucharist, his body and blood, the gift that he gives to us of the priesthood, and the call to humble service. I'm so delighted, my sisters, that you take so seriously the calling of our brother priests, that you pray for them, that they might be able to share in that great mission of Jesus Christ, the one high priest. As we heard in our first reading today, as we were reflecting on the suffering servant, there's great suffering that comes from being united with Christ, being united with that high priest, being united with the servant who suffers. Our priests who are given that great privilege of being able to celebrate the Eucharist, to make the Lord's body and blood present every time that they offer Mass, also have to be willing to embrace the suffering, some small way, that is Jesus's, that suffering that was foreseen already in the Old Testament with the suffering servant. And so, sisters, you have that opportunity to pray that our priests might persevere, that they might have that great insight about how it is that they have a privileged position to continue the ministry of Christ by being able to represent the sacrifice on Calvary Hill, to feed us with Jesus' own body and blood. But at the same time, as they come to recognize that that's a privilege, that they recognize that they're called to humble service. The privilege that we priests have to be able to do that is not a privilege that requires anyone to lift us up and put us on a pedestal. I ask you this morning to please pray for our priests that they might be humble servants, that they might recognize that whatever gifts they've been given, whether it be their natural gifts, whether it be the gift that they received at baptism and confirmation, whether it be the gift that they received at priestly ordination or diaconate ordination, that they recognize that that gift is always in service of others. In these last 50 years since the Second Vatican Council, the Church has really struggled with communicating that proper vision of the priest. Certainly there was an attempt to eliminate certain excesses as people came to see in the priest something that he wasn't, that they treated him as if he weren't human. Those of you, and I see a good number of mothers of priests and mothers of seminarians, you know that your sons are very human. You probably still have to pick up their glasses off of the table, I understand. But at the same time, there was also another current that was unwilling to recognize how it is that Christ changes that man when he's ordained. How it is that he does that not because of an extraordinary love for him, which he loves all of us, but he does that because of his love for the church and a desire to continue that work that he began. That work that he began at Calvary, that work that was anticipated in the cenacle in that upper room. We need to make sure that we have priests who are humble servants. I would say that I could offer that insight, I think, at any time in the history of the church, but I think that really in these days, those prayers that you offer for our priests that they be humble servants are more important than ever. All kinds of attacks on the church, attacks on the priesthood, an unwillingness to understand or to strive to understand how it is that the Lord serves us through the priesthood. You need to pray for our priests that they might be able to withstand those challenges, that they, as men with faults and failings, might be able to conform themselves so closely to Christ that not only are they able to efficaciously offer the sacrifice of the Mass, but that they're able to give insights to all of us into Jesus the servant, Jesus that humble servant, Jesus the one who came to make sure that we would know his Father's love. That means we in any vocation, that we can't betray that. We have to be faithful to that. We have to have some sense for how it is that God desires to use us, that he creates us in a way that's part of his great plan. Cardinal Newman would often say that he had a beautiful meditation on how it is that God has created us for a singular purpose. Each of us, not just priests. But we have to make sure that we're able to give ourselves so that we can be that link in the chain that God had in mind from the beginning of time. Certainly we all need prayers that we're able to respond in that way, but our brothers, our priests, need that I think in particular in these days. I can't tell you how inspired I am when I look out at this church and recognize that there are so many faithful women who are praying for the church. I know, because Christ has promised that the church will prevail, I know we get through this difficult moment. But if I think about who the infantry might be, it might be an all-female infantry in this battle, Because you have that ability, I think, by your prayers, by your steadfastness, by your hope of being able to sustain our priests at this difficult time. So I thank you for that. I encourage you to keep up the battle. I encourage you not to lose hope, even when you hear about all kinds of abuses of power or all kinds of faults and failings of those in clerical leadership positions. But rather to keep before your eyes that image of Christ the high priest. Pray that our priests, most especially the priests of this archdiocese, might be able to conform themselves to that image, that they might find the joy that comes from uniting themselves with Christ's sacrifice, not just at Mass, but in all of life, and that they might be able then to communicate not only the joy of living out one's vocation, but also to give us as a church the graces that we need to sustain these great battles. We're certainly strengthened by what our priests are able to do in the confessional. We're strengthened by what the priest is able to do every time that Mass is celebrated. We're strengthened by his ability to remind us of Christ, who's both high priest and humble servant. One of the things about our church, and I apologize, I'm going on for a long time, but one of the things about our church is we're very much more a church of and than of or. And so it's not a question, a choice of being either high priest or humble servant. It's not an or, it's an and. So we want to make sure, pray for me, pray for our priests, that we might be both sharers in the high priesthood of Jesus Christ, and at the same time sharers in his willingness to serve, to be that humble servant, to be the one who comes to nourish us, to strengthen us, and to lead us on the way.